Gaurav, great to have you here with us at PwC. Gaurav, you're the CEO and founder of TruKKer, a mobility platform which doesn't look at passengers, but at freight. And usually when we talk about the future of mobility and the electrification, decarbonization, making the way how we move smarter and more sustainable, a lot of people mainly focus on passengers, but the freight element is such a key one that I'm very glad we're talking about. And we recently published a piece of thought leadership. It was a great collaboration. Thank you for that one. And now we're here to discuss it and to reflect on our findings. But before we do that, you obviously stand for an innovative mobility platform, TruKKer. There is a subsidiary which looks at even more innovative, more electric ways to move, which is Atomics. Can you tell us a little bit about TruKKer and Atomics, how they differ, and what makes it unique in the market?
No, sure. And it's a pleasure being here. Thank you for having me. And we've enjoyed our work with you and your team over the last year on the electric mobility specifically. Now, quickly on TruKKer. TruKKer is the largest digital freight platform in the region. We aggregate full truckload demand from 1,200 plus enterprise clients. It's 100% enterprise business. And we then match that demand in real time using our proprietary technology with 70,000 plus driver fleet that is spread across 9 operating countries. So we pretty much dominate as the biggest freight operator in the full truckload segment in UAE, Saudi, and Turkey. And it's 100% asset light. So we depend heavily on data science, both from customer SLA requirements to quality of supply and the best techniques in managing supply. We also invest heavily on technology towards creating operating benchmarks for different supply for different industries. Like a construction material company would have very different SLAs to a FMCG, and we use technology as our filtering mechanism of making that demand supply matching as easy as possible. And as part of the business model, we also heavily invest in solving financial constraints for the supply. So I think trucking industry is one of the 3 largest sectors in the world, and it remains highly fragmented compared to construction or agriculture, which are the other 2 large segments. And the fragmentation in the region or most of the emerging market is even more acute because of lack of financial access to capital or conventional products. And at the same time, it is a heavy investment industry. You need to have a truck which costs much more than starting a small shop on the corner of the street. So we focus heavily on solving the working capital for our suppliers. So that also creates our own fintech, where we process all these payments between the client, the shipper, to the actual service provider through a digital solution. Atomics, I think our interest area for today is one of our subsidiaries, which is we look at it as a very future mobility platform. We feel that the energy transition in the mobility sector, I think you pointed out, where a lot of people don't realize almost 40% of emissions on the roads are from commercial vehicles, and especially heavy commercial vehicles. And electrifying 1 big truck is equal to electrifying 20 passenger vehicles, so 20 plus, depends on which part of the world you're looking at. But so it's definitely
which size of the truck.
Correct. And the size and the emission impact from every 1 unit electrified or transitioned is much more, in the commercial vehicle. However, I think that needs much more infrastructure development and all that. So yes, Atomics is focused on building an ecosystem. It's not an OEM. It is not a battery producer. It is not a charge point operator. It realizes that in our markets of TruKKer, where we have a lot of deep data science, we could actually bridge that gap between motivated corporations, which are limited to very few big ones, and the gap in knowledge and the first mover anxiety that a transportation sector would have, which is typically smaller than other parts.
Well, let's dive deeper into the electrification part, and I think Atomics is the perfect segue into that topic. And you already touched upon infrastructure. We're going to go deeper into that part, which is a very critical element, obviously, to how to electrify the fleet of the future a little bit later on. But before we do that, where do you see the electrification of trucks in the world today? And is that what customers really want?
So I think globally in 2024, there were 90,000 electric vehicles in the commercial vehicle segment that got sold. And I think the majority of that was in China. So I think if you look at this globally, then there is one front runner, which is the Chinese ecosystem in the commercial vehicle segment, actually also in the passenger vehicle segment.
From a supply side or both supply and
I
demand
think both
side?
supply and demand in overall adoption.
All
I
right.
think the adoption in, this is a big shift. You're asking a sector to change the core OE, the equipment that it was using as the energy transition, and that has to happen both from the macro regulation policy making side, at the same time the private sector motivation to transition into something which is more environmentally friendly. So China is a front runner both in terms of execution top down and also adoption bottom up, and then followed by America and Europe. I think are fairly behind, but then they still have made some numbers, and there is a lot of commitments from corporations, and we see that actually momentum catching up more. But one big challenge in overall electrification is something that the electrification industry does not control, is fuel prices. So in commercial vehicle, if you think of it, the fundamental challenge is economics. So you would buy a Porsche Taycan or you would buy an electric G-Wagon without really thinking of how much are you saving per day, per month, because that's not one of the objectives of electrifying for a passenger, while it's exactly the opposite on commercial vehicles.
Of course, it's profit-driven.
Correct. You're not going to electrify if your cost per delivery or cost per ton of for transportation is going to go up. And that's why unit economics have to make sense. And that's where the top-down incentives and upfronting the capital expenditure from public sector is extremely important.
So obviously, governments have the opportunity to incentivize, as you already hinted at, but to stimulate the uptake of electric mobility in different markets. Before we also are going to put a spotlight on the Middle East, which we want to do today, you mentioned US, you mentioned China. Did you really see governmental stimulus as a Kickstarter for the electrification of heavy transport, or was that really market and technology driven?
I think for the case of China, it was both. And from what we understand, even now that it is scaling up, is actually now driven more by innovation in the product and the constantly optimization of the cost of the product. And but now the unit economics make sense. I think until the time unit economics makes sense, because unit economics only start making sense at a certain scale.
Yes.
And that's where the public sector has to really front end the investment, not just in incentives by making cheaper, but you can obviously reduce some taxes which are applicable on the sector. At the same time, as the infrastructure is the other core element, I think if you look at also commercial vehicle electrification, you have to split the ones that run in an urban environment, which are vans and light trucks, versus those that are the heavy trucks which run in ports or industrial corridors. And the infrastructure investment is very different. One requires a megawatt capacity charging. The other one can pretty much share the charging with the passenger vehicles. If you look at China at their scale now, they already see in cities like Shenzhen and Shanghai and certain long-haul corridors where they're actually sharing infrastructure with the passenger vehicles, but paying a cheaper price because they're off-taking at a off-peak hour. There are multiple power purchase agreements that are being signed where it's making cheaper electricity for them.
But that works for lighter trucks.
If they have to share the infrastructure.
Yes. For heavy trucks, it's a different story, correct?
It's a completely different story.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And in order to generate a profitable business model for heavy truck charging operators, they obviously need the scale.
Correct.
How do you see a China, which for me is probably the poster child of electrification, and also meanwhile they have claimed the title as the home of the electric vehicle to some degree, when you look at how they drive economies of scale in production, but also in operations. How can an ecosystem be generated for heavy truck charging that is profitable for the CPOs, for the charge point operators?
So I think the charge point operations business in China also continues to still remain at very close to break even. I don't think there's a super profitable charge point operator because of the front ending of the investment, which you have to then recover over a period of time.
It's very capex heavy, especially also with the grid connection and the transformers that you need.
Correct. And that's where I think countries like UAE would have great advantage, or even Saudi Arabia, where the energy distributors right now, they're the best place to invest into such things. But I think from a China angle, I think their innovation right now drives their cost of the unit economics going down. I think while they have already put a lot of infrastructure in the urban environment and certain long-haul corridors, I think the ability to then constantly improve on unit economics because the after-sale network is available for a lot of OEMs that are selling in thousands of vehicles. And at the same time, the private sector does not have that anxiety risk anymore, because that's a big anxiety risk when you're transitioning as a supplier of transportation services. You don't know about the depreciation. You don't know about the salvage or the resale value. And all of these are real impacts on your decision making towards doing that. At the same time, clients are probably not willing to sign 5-year contracts because they see that the cost of the vehicle can keep going down. So everybody is in a wait and watch, and that's where the advanced economies like China, which are rightly calling themselves to be the whatever electrification hub and all of that, are removing that chicken and egg. And that's where I think the public sector needs to step up first, and I think private sector, the large corporations, need to step up as well. I think those are things which are, but I think it's the next decade. I think globally, to answer your question, I think it's the next decade which will see a lot of alternatives to diesel vehicles. Some of them might be hydrogen. I don't know. I believe it's much further away.
I agree.
So I think electrification is the instant one that can happen, and unit economics already makes sense in a lot of parts of the world.
All right, so I think it's fair to say that when we look at some parts of the world, and China probably stands out, it is possible to create attractive, profitable electric ecosystems, not only in passenger transport, but also in the transport of goods, including heavy transport. All right, now let's move our focus to the Middle East, and we're sitting here in our offices in Dubai today, one of the exciting places in the Middle East, including obviously Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and other parts as well, that are driving the future towards more sustainable electric mobility as well. And here, in our co-authored thought leadership, we established that without any change in policy and regulation, we only expect that 1%, approximately 1% of annual heavy truck sales will remain battery electric unless somebody turns the needle. Which leads me to the question, what will it take in the Middle East to, I don't want to say replicate the Chinese model, but to at least accelerate the electrification of this very important part of mobility when we want to decarbonize transport?
I think globally the single biggest barrier is economics.
Yeah.
So, and that economics is even more acute in terms of the delta in unit economics between the Middle East, which, let's take this case of long haul trucking. The Middle East actually thrives on used trucks from Europe. And you could import a truck as long as it's not more than 10, or I think in the UAE it should be less than 20-year-old as a vehicle. And then you want to transition into something which will require upfront cost. Chinese OEMs are front running to have that unit economics delta as small as possible, but still a typical heavy electric vehicle is 3.5 to 4 times more expensive compared to the used truck. And I think some of the data is in our report.
It is. Yeah.
So that makes the biggest impact. So when the chief sustainability officer of a large corporation wants electrification, somehow the chief financial officer overrules that eventually. And that's what we've seen also across the region here in the Middle East, where from a private sector perspective, because of our relationship with hundreds and hundreds of clients in each of our markets, we see the motivation is real. There are real commitments that come top down, especially in the big corporations, but then it results into completing pilots, ending up with a unit economic study, which results into saying, hey, it's too expensive. And if you look at from the public sector, I think one of the things that the region needs to appreciate that it is the cost of energy for us in the UAE and Saudi is one of the lowest in the world.
Yes.
A typical electric kilowatt hour is 20 fils or lesser per kilowatt hour. And in the UAE, the charge point operators are mandated to sell at 1.2. So that's 6 times the cost of energy. And I think I and you pay about 40 fils at home. So it's 3 times of the cost that an individual pays at home. So it's counterintuitive. You want the commercial trucking to electrify and reduce your emissions in futuristic cities like Dubai. I think is one of the most advanced cities in a lot of ways. But then how does it electrify if it wants its trucks to buy power at 6 times the cost of power, while it has the biggest solar farm in the world? And all of these don't reflect. So I think that policy making will catch up soon. And I think commercial vehicle needs a separate focus. And places like Saudi have an additional challenge, even though a lot of clients there are motivated, because the diesel price is even cheaper. So that unit economics comparison, which when you compare your diesel truck with your electric truck, that delta even becomes cheap, more because your diesel is that much cheaper in Saudi.
So obviously you're calling indirectly for a subsidized charging tariff for trucks because they will be more attractive for fleet operators that are profit-oriented, have to be profit-oriented because they're business people, to incentivize the transition to electric. Do you see in other parts of the world where you operate different tariff structures for passenger cars versus trucks, electric trucks?
So as a first point, we don't need the power cost to be subsidized by the government. I think if you look at UAE as a
but you want a better tariff.
Yes, they can't do 1.2 because the 1.2, the guy who's charging his G-Wagon or Porsche Taycan, he doesn't care and he wants to charge his car. But that doesn't work. But it doesn't have to be cheaper than the cost of power. So I think our unit economics says that in the UAE, as long as the cost of power to the commercial vehicle is below 70 fils, which is still like 3.5 times of the cost of power, it would make positive unit economics. And we've also tested the charging ecosystem and how much it costs to put a power charger, because those are the things that Atomics has done. That you could 70 fils is good enough to make a positive return on charging charge point operator. China has strong use cases where commercial power is also different in off-peak hours. So a lot of times, if you see the peak loads in another
dynamic pricing, then
it's dynamic pricing, and it's very much matches well with anything which does not have to charge at a peak hour of people commuting to work or going in over weekends to malls and stuff like that. And plus, there is also precedence of power purchase agreements where commercial operators are selling a certain amount of megawatts per month, per year to one buyer who has a large fleet. And then they use that over a set of chargers from the charge point operator and then have bulk discounts.
Let me ask you a follow-up question on that one. We often see in many parts of the world when particularly commercial operators choose to electrify their fleet, that they combine this with their own solar generation capacity. Very often fleet operators have big properties with rooftops or parking which you can cover with solar PV. Do you see that also as an opportunity to further drive down the cost of mobility for large-scale fleet operators that may have depots that you can equip with solar? Because we're not only living in a region with low energy prices, but that has a wealth of solar energy potential.
No, I think you're absolutely spot on. I think that's efficiency you gain at scale. So you can't achieve that if you have to then start storing power or compensating with high cost power at peak times. But if you are operating a depot at scale, I think that's very much the case that should work here. I think there will be slightly more additional investments that you'll have to do into battery banks because you will not generate and consume power at the same speed. But that also becomes unit economics positive when you get at a certain scale. And some of these depot operators can do that.
All right. I think very clear, the cost needs to come down, and that is driven by scale and obviously by governments kickstarting the engine with be it mandates or subsidies or different ways to incentivize the uptake of electric mobility in the B2B sector. That could be a way to get there, to start creating the scale and then to manage out the subsidies again as an organic market is created. Another challenge right now is the lack of available electric truck models on the market.
Right.
So we have seen that generally this is an embryonic market still globally, and particularly in the Middle East, there is only 70% actually of the models in the market that you can get elsewhere are missing here. Where do you see right now the supply market of electric trucks picking up, and which ones are the front runners, which countries are the front runners to produce and distribute these trucks globally? Is it only China, or do you see other regions emerging as well?
I think this is driven, again, I think a lot of it is economics. From a Middle East perspective, I think Middle East has to cross an additional barrier compared to a China, Europe, or say India, South America, that the market is not that large. You can't compare the whole of GCC with half of India or 20% of China. So you have to have that scale to motivate OEMs to come and set shop in your market to sell and also provide after-sale services. However, I think what we covered earlier in the discussion, that China is pretty much front-running in terms of OEM and also battery. I think in the electric ecosystem, the battery is probably more critical than anything else, because it is truly, like, we've now done it over 2 years, multiple pilots with clients, and we see what goes wrong is nothing in the engine or any mechanical part, which in diesel vehicle. And that's why we're so convinced that over the years the world would find out that the resale value of an electric should be higher, where you can pretty much just upgrade your battery pack and use the same chassis and the mechanical parts. But coming back to the main countries that would front run, I think China is putting a lot of interest in the Middle East. We have now 15 plus brands in the commercial vehicle, even though it's much smaller, like you said, in other parts of the world. So Middle East has that additional challenge. And but overall, I think globally, India, China, and Europe. I think Europe has, we see a lot of carbon-related mandates that are coming down from the government, which result into real tax credits and things like that, because that's an indirect incentivization to bring your cost parity. So those places would definitely improve. North America, I don't know, when Mr. Trump says, drill baby drill for more oil, so it's a bit uncertain. But Europe, China, India, South America, I think are front runners.
So we see already over the last years, and this trend is not going to stop, battery prices coming down significantly, which is obviously driven by the economies of scale in the production, the exponentially rising demand for batteries. We see battery capacities improving. We see charging speeds increasing and ranges increasing as well. Is the future of heavy transport battery electric, or is it also hydrogen? You already mentioned hydrogen earlier.
I think the heavy transport would evolve over the next few years, and it would not be like right now it might be 99% diesel. I think that's going to evolve into a few. I think electric one will be the fastest one because it's already ready. It's already at certain scale that can just multiply year over year. But I think in the next 10 years or so, as hydrogen offers the biggest advantage on long-haul trucking, because rapidly you refuel like you refuel gas, and at the same time it offers tank-based supply, so you're not really constrained by the size of the battery. But hydrogen has huge barriers and infrastructure upgrade cost, and the cost of storing it, and so that requires a much more financial investment compared to electric. But I think if you look at a 10-year horizon, then the other one is the biofuels, and some of these they're not zero emission, but they're like an intermediate stage where overall emissions will come down. But I think electric vehicle has the highest promise.
Okay. And obviously that's very much driven by the increased energy efficiency. You don't have to first convert it into hydrogen and then convert it back into energy. It's just there in the battery.
Correct.
So, and I, by the way, believe that as well. However, I believe there will be some hydrogen use cases where battery just won't work, maybe super long corridors without charging opportunities. So there is something. Now let me come to one last element of our conversation that I'd like to spend a little bit more time on, which is the future of transport is not only increasingly electric, it's also going to be increasingly autonomous, particularly in an environment where operators have to pay a lot of attention at driving down cost, and the driver is a cost element. How autonomous do you see the future of trucking?
To be honest, the autonomous trucking is actually a much more desired transition. Like when autonomous trucking becomes commercially available, we would not have to convince transportation sector to become autonomous, because the entire sector, whether you're doing last mile deliveries or quick commerce or what we do, long haul trucking, the weakest link in the entire operations of that business is the human. So even the efficiency at which you drive your diesel vehicle, is a lot of it is driven by the human operating that vehicle. So if you can remove the operator and make the operations of an equipment like you would want a conveyor belt to move, then I think autonomous has that promise. So I think, however, I think autonomous would happen also from a function of the unit economics in the beginning. Like if you look at right now port operations, any of the shuttle operations. Those are where pilots are happening, but sensor technology remains expensive. Regulations about humanless cabins where you can save the cost of the driver. My point earlier was the cost saving of the driver is not as much as a motivation versus the improved efficiency of not requiring him there. So I think the industry would move to a phase where you will have supervised, the guy can sleep in the cabin or remain half awake with coffee but keep riding for 10 hours like you're in a train. I think those things will have certain transitions,
of course,
baby steps ahead, but otherwise autonomous is something which is becoming more and more real. And I think as soon as the Elon Musk's kinds of people of the world can solve 6G real-time data through satellites where you're not losing vision AI-based reading the street and taking actions, that processing power is already there in the current 2025. AI GPUs are strong enough as long as the telecom operators don't charge you a bomb for 24-hour constant streaming, because that's what you need. You constantly have to stream, and you have to process that data to constantly take decisions, which is autonomous. And I think with the censored cost going down, I think that's what I'm really excited about the future of this industry, where utilizations will significantly go up, cost of underutilization will significantly go down, because now it's an equipment and not the human and the man hours that cost on top. And the whole thing, if you think about long-haul trucking, is one of the most difficult professions in the world. You want humans not to do long-haul trucking. I feel sometimes bad for the security guy on a gate, and I'm like, man, this is like a very bad job that you can give to a human sitting the whole day and getting a barrier up and down. I think trucking is like this. People stay away from homes. They sometimes have very harsh conditions on long-haul driving. They are also the security guard of the cargo, even if they're resting. So this is something which you want to remove as a human task. And I think autonomous trucking has that promise.
Fantastic. Gaurav, I think we can agree the future of mobility, be it in the passenger and in the freight transport sector, is increasingly electric, increasingly autonomous. TruKKer has started to lead a big part of that. And it sounds like you're on the right path to continue doing even more so.
We are trying. I think it's because it's so nascent in our regions. I think we are trying to do what public sector government would want from a private sector player or regulators or even OEMs. We want to be able to take the risk before other people and figure out unit economics and things like that. So yes, we're trying, and we're quite happy to be at these times when things are changing fast.
Great. Well, good luck with that, and great to meet you here today. Thank you for the great conversation.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Gaurav.